Woot woot.
Okay, welcome back to Veriano 1711 podcast. This is your host, Marv. Today we're joined before I go there, introducing our guest, I want to say hi to Zach. Zach, how are you doing today?
Doing good. Pleasure to join you.
Thank you, sir. So, yeah, the topic is showing up on your thumbnail, people. And today we're going to be discussing Professor Meghan Henning's this book about health. Professor Henning, thank you for being here. Thank
Okay.
you for accepting our invitation. It's an awesome to hear here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so this is set for a good deal here. I was saying to Professor Henning off camera, this is a topic that I really want to learn a lot because many of us have many questions, ideas, preconceptions about health. So before we go there, jumping into the question, Professor Henning, just give us a bit of your background, who you are, for people who's not aware of your work, your credentials. So we're going to take it from there.
Yeah, so my name is Meghan Henning. I am the professor of Christian origins at the University of Dayton, and I'm also a senior assistant provost for undergraduate curriculum and student success here. I am interested in hell and disability studies, and I am also working on a current project on prayer and the body and contemporary thought on and ancient thought on emotions and prayer. But the research interests are all coalescing around, for me, biblical texts or early Christian texts that are interpreted or used in ways today that are harmful to people. And so the interest in hell for me stems from a realization that I had early on that people could be reading the same biblical passage or text, and one person could read it in a way that was helpful to someone, and someone else could be reading the very same text in a way that was really hurtful. And that stemmed from some trauma that my own family underwent, and the way that people in my own, I was raised Lutheran, and there were people that meant very well, but would say things that really made us feel like that we had done something wrong, or were not faithful enough. And that was why we are experiencing suffering. And so that began my interest in suffering, and then my interest in hell came alongside of that, as well as my interest in disability studies.
Thank you. Well, I just want to say this from the get-go. It's good to hear. It's refreshing to hear from a scholar. We're talking to a human people because, many of us, myself, I have gone through kind of the same experience because, that kind of fear-mongering thing going on as you grow up. And, I can say that they are well-intentioned, but those preconceptions are misguided, at least from a historical point of view. And that's something we want to address today. Zach, any comments so far?
No, sounds good. That sounds terrible that you had to go through that, but it's also really important people to know that happens and why that's important.
Sure. Yeah. All right. So let's jump right in here on the questions. So the first question is showing up on the screen, Professor Henning. So, just in broad strokes, please tell us what your book is about and what did it prompt you to write on this topic?
So, my book is about the way that language about hell and understandings about hell that we think of. So, when I tell my students, tell me what you think when you hear the word hell, we think of a fiery place of torment with people being punished and fire, etc. That description of hell really does not emerge in the New Testament texts themselves, though it starts there. Early Christians invented the way that we think about hell, and the way that other traditions even think about hell develops alongside of that between the 1st and 4th centuries CE. And then when Dante writes the Inferno, he has read a text called the Apocalypse of Paul. And the Apocalypse of Paul that he has just read then becomes a blueprint for the hell that he describes that gets mediated to today, and that really frames the way that people think about damnation and hell. One of the things that I realized as I was teaching on this topic is that my students weren't really aware that when Dante does that, he brings, and when we read Dante or we read the Apocalypse of Paul, we bring forward more than just the idea of eternal punishment. Those early Christian texts are imagining eternal punishment with the things that are close at hand to them, like Roman notions of incarceration and punishment, like ancient ideas about gender and the body and disability. And so women's bodies and the bodies of the sick and disabled and the bodies of those who are of lower status in society become the model, and also ancient notions of criminal justice become the model for how we think about God and God's justice today. And that also influences our own society's thinking about criminal justice as well, and disability and gender. So there's a relationship between the way that we think about the afterlife and the way that we think about society broadly and the way that we think about ourselves. And we don't realize how much we're bringing forward to today with depictions of hell or the idea of hell itself.
Okay, now you mentioned you brought up this term gender. Okay,
Mhm.
that catch. I don't know about you, Zach, but that caught my attention right there.
Yeah.
And actually, you can find it on the subtitle of this book. It's Gender Disability and the Inventions of Damned Bodies. So just take us from there. I mean, it's only just zeroing in on women, which is perhaps I'm being anachronistic here. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but that may sound like misogynistic in and of itself. So is that the route you're following there, Dr. Henning?
So in antiquity, the idea of the body and also ancient understandings of medicine are framed around what was observable. So women were thought to be weaker, more porous, as in like their bodies had more holes, more fluid, leaky, and cold. So the idea of, and then this is observable. So we know from osteoarchaeological evidence that women actually died earlier than men in every era of antiquity and late antiquity. And we think that this likely has to do with the fact that they were expected to repeatedly have children and that there were no prenatal vitamins, right? So their bodies literally broke down from what they were expected to do by society. So the medical authors and the thinkers in the broader culture are observing that women seem to be less robust than men. And they develop theories about the body and about the self that are based on these observations. So you have an early Christian thinker like Clement saying in the 2nd century that to be man is to be hairy and to be strong and impervious, and that women are born to suffer. And the word there is passio, the word for the passion. So Clement has this theory of a Christian understanding of gender that's very much based on ancient ideas about medicine and the body, and that really did prioritize male embodiment and male existence, and that then also understood that to suffer was to be effeminate and to be female. And so it does sound to us patriarchal, and it's not a coincidence. It's because the whole society is framed around an idea of gender and the body that understands women to be weaker and also weakness to be womanly.
Thank you, Dr. Henning. This is an extra from your intro. I want to read it for our audience. Today, only 20% of the worldwide population and 56% of the US population believes in the existence of hell. In the popular imagination, however, hell is hotter than ever. I like that. So talk of hell is ubiquitous. Ubiquitous. How about that? Well, I'm an exception. I don't know about you guys, but yeah, I'm an exception. But yeah, I remember my father years before his passing. He started to he entered in some, I don't know what you call it, but something they do in churches. They call it here courses, but perhaps that's not the technical term. But he was supposed to receive some classes about any specific subject. So he had some interest in hell, the devil, that kind of stuff. And by the time he entered those to receive those classes, he was like just 100% committed to the idea of hell being a real place. But the person who gave the classes and everything, I don't know, maybe he was a great pedagogical kind of people there. But by the time the course come to an end, my father changed his mind on hell, because the way he explained these things from a historical point of view just leave an imprint in his thought that maybe this was more something coming from people's imagination, prompted by some really deep motives, religious motives, philosophical or social motivations. So I don't know. And this is something that you said in your book only in US. What about the rest of the other countries?
Yeah.
I'm from Honduras, Central America, and most of the people here, Dr. Denning and Zach, they believe in hell. Like it is a literally, fire burning place that every sinner would go there to account for their sins. But this is not the route you're taking in your book. It's taken from a different point of view. Zach, I don't know if you got anything to say so far.
Yeah, that is really interesting, especially because you talk about how where you were from, that scholarship sometimes takes a little bit time to get there. I think that from what I grew up with and most people around me, that hell is, it's like eternal conscious torment. And if you don't believe that, you're not a Christian, you're a terrible person because you're not believing the Bible. But then sometime in the last 10 years, just that alone, the idea, other views of universalism or conditionalism, those types of views have been, it's like okay for Christians to believe that all of a sudden in the last 10 years. And I think that's kind of where we see scholarship reaching lay people and people realizing, oh, okay, maybe there's better ways to look at this topic, or maybe even something like what John Walton believes. But yeah, that is really interesting what you said there, and I also appreciate what you said there, Megan. On there's certainly the topic of women and misogyny is really interesting, specifically when we get on the topic of hell, which I was hoping you'd get into a little bit further as we go, because if I'm reading these texts, I'm not going to be thinking about like, oh, it's kind of weird that they would say that about women in this. I would just be reading it and like, okay, odd comment, but I'll keep going. But it's a lot deeper than that. So I'll be interested to see where we go from here.
Yeah. So just real quick, I like what you both brought forward about the scholarship influencing the way that people think about whether hell is a literal place or if there are other ways to read those texts. So my first book was really focused on hell as rhetoric, and the way in which you can read the New Testament passages about hell in line with other understandings of descriptive rhetoric in the 1st century CE, which is that the purpose of describing another place like this, the way that the New Testament authors do, and then the apocalyptic authors in the descriptions of hell that I talk about in Hell Hath No Fury, is really to persuade audiences to to do or think something, right? And so in these texts, it's very clear that the purpose is to persuade audiences to behave in a particular way and to follow certain ethical norms. So in the New Testament Gospels, the depictions of hell are really there to frame what it means to be a follower of Jesus in the first century. And in the Gospel of Matthew in particular, right, it is, if we look at Matthew 25, those are all the social norms that are expressly described in the Sermon on the Mount. And then in the eschatological vision of the sheep and the goats, the people who are identified as goats are the people who don't do the things that Jesus told them to do in the Sermon on the Mount, namely caring for the least of these. One of the things when I talk to church audiences about this that I really like to emphasize a lot is that we have been told in contemporary contexts again and again that somehow belief is what determines one's eternal fate. But one of the really interesting things when you look at these texts, whether it's the New Testament or the later texts that describe hell, they're really not focused on belief at all. In a few instances, yes, but the earliest texts are very focused on what you do and who you are as a person. And so the purpose of these is to educate and to persuade people to behave ethically. And when we know that they're rooted and grounded in punishment, notions of punishment, notions of the body, notions of disability that we really don't think match the message and person of Jesus, we have to ask ourselves if eternal punishment or hell is the best pedagogical tool that we have in our toolkit today as Christians. And so I think there are a lot of really good reasons to rethink the way that we read those biblical passages.
Okay, true confessions here. I tried once to talk about this topic about hell, not being a real place and everything. And I almost got burned at the stake because it's just because and I understand. Most of us are coming out of our conservative backdrops, and it is only my personal experience. I don't know about you, Zach, but my personal experience is that I got to know someone who was a scholar. He's not with us any longer. And then I got enthralled with biblical studies. And once you taste that, there's no going back. At least that was my experience. And I tried once, like I'm telling you, and people, they were very respectful, but you were seeing like raising eyebrows. I was in the front of the pulpit, and you can see the landscape, people, they are frowning, their faces. Oh no, this is not getting good. But at least I gave it a shot, I tried. But I learned that most of the times you don't need a pulpit to persuade people otherwise. Sometimes, I'm not sure if this applies to all the cases, but sometimes it's your exemplar on the basic things you're doing, like, loving people above any bad behaviors or whatnot. But that can speak volumes. And sometimes most of the people, at least in my experience, lay people, the lady, if you go there like talking big words, being like intellectual, most of the time that doesn't work. You need to switch it and just change the approach. So I just want to get it off my chest there. So moving on here with the questions, Professor Henning. In your intro, you write about eternal suffering between reality and imagination. And in there, you mentioned tours of hell. Okay, this is good. Apocalypses. So can you please further elaborate on the importance of these ideas to the argument of the book?
Sure. It's related to what we were just talking about. The earliest texts that describe hell in the Christian imagination, the New Testament Gospels and then the Apocalypses, are doing imaginative work, and they're doing imaginative work in the apocalyptic tradition. So, and within the framework of ancient rhetoric. So the idea is that you can't describe something to an ancient audience in a text and expect that when they hear that text read out loud, that they'll be able to imagine it, unless it's something that they're familiar with. So these texts use images from the world that these people live in order to persuade them to behave in particular ways. And so they're using extreme images of violence, of punishment, things that they would know from their contemporary world. And they're using them in particular to persuade people to avoid sins. And the sins in these texts are not the same from era to era, that the author would specifically identify as a problem. They're, in turn, though, creating reality for the people that are hearing them read. And so they are imaginative, and then because the descriptions are persuasive and draw on images that would be familiar to people in the audience, they have a way of creating reality as well. And they have a way of constructing reality for us too. So when I talk about them living between the real and the imaginary, when we say something is imaginative, it does not mean that it's only imaginative and therefore doesn't have power, right? That is the piece of the argument that I'm trying to push back on scholarship that would just go so far as to say, well, we have evidence historically that hell doesn't exist because of X, Y, or Z, piece of historical information in the text. For ancient people, the question of does hell exist would be a sort of non sequitur. That wouldn't be the question that they would ask, because they have this tradition of tours of hell in ancient literature where it's understood that these descriptions are for the purpose of being evocative and helping the audience learn. And so the question that an ancient person would ask is not, is it real? They would ask, who's there and why are they there? And what am I supposed to take away from this? And so then when we read that as a literal description of how things are, we take a text that was meant for a particular audience and to convey a particular educational message, and we have maximum opportunity to do real harm because we read it as a blueprint, which is not how it was intended to be understood.
Thank you, Dr. Henning. So following the slides here, you said, in the Tours of Hell, I argue that damned inhabitant disabled female imprisoned bodies for all of eternity, using bodily normativity as a way to depict eternal torment relies upon familiar imagery of the body to depict the afterlife. Now, you said that was not the question, how this place was like, but who is there? Which is something we, 21st century people, perhaps we don't think that way. We're just, the place is there. It's going to burn you, and beware about those flames. And perhaps this is another point where ancient people is not like us. They think very differently. They see the world. They have a different worldview. I don't know what you say about that, Dr. Henning, because we made the mistake that people, in the time of Jesus, Paul, Second Temple literature and everything, that they're just like us in thinking. And no, it's different. That's all I can say. Yeah.
No, it's a different worldview. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on here. Let's go with the third question here.
Marv, I just sorry to interrupt. Just for the audience sake, Dr. Henning, could you just really, really briefly talk more about what happens in these tours of hell, just so people can understand what we're talking about here?
Yeah, thank you. So the tours of hell. So the earliest one is the Apocalypse of Peter. That's written in the 2nd century. The Apocalypse of Paul is probably the most famous one. The most copies were written of that. We have a large number of copies, and that's the text that I mentioned that Dante read. It's based off of the Apocalypse of Peter, that earlier 2nd century text. These are texts where we have a saint. So like the Apocalypse of Peter, St. Peter is being taken on a tour of afterlife spaces or otherworldly spaces. One of them is hell, and then there's a heaven scene in that text as well. And it is, as he's being taken on this tour, it's written exactly though the angelic guide is pointing out the sites like you would on a tour. So here are the people that committed this sin, and here's the punishment that they're receiving. The punishments that they're receiving are following the logic of lex talionis, or measure for measure, or the law of retaliation, the measure for measure punishments. That is an ancient concept of justice, right? So that the punishment must somehow fit the crime. Those, for example, who have committed the crime, a sexual related crime, are hung up by their genitals for all of eternity. And that is the punishments themselves are also coded according to the worldview of the ancient authors that wrote them. And so that's where the ideas about the body and gender come into play that I was talking about. So you have ancient ideas of justice. You also have in these texts visions of hell that look like ancient prisons. And so there is a real intentional connection to the social structure and the justice system and the worldview in which the text is written, really trying to get people to imagine these spaces and to feel like they are there, right? So they are meant to feel real, even if the reality of the space is not really the point of the text, if that is helpful.
Now, Dr. Henning, we're getting here into, the difference between canonical literature and non-canonical literature.
Some people might be Apocalypse of Paul. That's not in my Bible. What's going on here?
Yeah, that's
what is she
last
talking
time I
about?
checked, that was not in my Bible.
No, it is not. So the Apocalypse of Peter, the Apocalypse of Paul, the Apocalypse of Mary, these are not what we would call canonical texts. Now, it's interesting though, because the Apocalypse of Peter was almost included in the Bible. It is in some early lists that we would think of as a precursor to the closing of the canon or the Bible. And it's interesting, in one fragment, the Moratorian fragment, the author says that some people do not think that the Apocalypse of Peter should be read in church because it's frightening. So then you have others, though, who think that like Augustine, who is actually concerned because in these apocalypses, there is often a kind of escape clause where there's mercy for the damned. There's a recurring theme where the saint weeps for the damned and begs God or Jesus to have mercy on them. And they are given some kind of respite from their torment. In some cases, released entirely from their torment, but in other cases, they just kind of get a day off or a couple of days off over Easter weekend from their suffering. So Augustine was really concerned about this and thought that if there was a way out, that these texts wouldn't be persuasive. And so people shouldn't read the Apocalypse of Peter or the Apocalypse of Paul because they weren't scary enough for Augustine.
Thank you. I got to ask you about this because this is more like a layman question. I mean, it says Apocalypse of Paul, Apocalypse of Peter, but in fact, it was not actually Paul or Peter themselves who wrote this literature, right?
That's correct. Yes.
There is a good... Go ahead.
But part of the framing of the story is to identify it with as though they had, yes.
Is this what your scholars call pseudepigraphy or
That's
something
right.
else?
Yes. Yeah, these are pseudepigraphic texts. They're the frame of the story is around the saint being kind of the authorizing figure, and that this being their vision is part of the story. That in the Apocalypse of Peter and the Apocalypse of Paul, that is the case. They're pseudepigraphic. The Greek Apocalypse of Mary, and so some of the Marian texts, not the Greek Apocalypse of Mary, but the Liber Requiem, which is a Dormition narrative, is actually, it's the Mary's tour of hell is embedded in a story of Mary's assumption. And so they had liturgical uses, and nobody thought that Mary wrote those. They're stories told from her perspective and about her, but they're not. Yeah. So the association with the saintly figure is understood to be pseudepigraphic, and in some of the conversations around, for example, the apocalypse of Peter, it seems that the concern is not that Peter didn't write it. It seems that the content is a bigger concern for people who are wondering whether this should be read or not. But the number of copies of these texts that exist, especially in the case of the Apocalypse of Peter and the Greek Apocalypse of Mary, indicate, and the fact that some of them were used liturgically for some time, indicate that they were understood as being books that were useful for Christians, even if they weren't in the canon.
All right, thank you. There is a question here from my co-host who is in Russia. He couldn't make it because it's midnight there.
Yeah.
So he wants you, please. He would like you to address his question, Dr. Henning. So it's showing up on the screen there.
Okay.
Can you talk about texts that talk about the punishment of the rebel angels and how that can frame our understanding of hell in the New Testament? And he gives lake of fire there, some biblical chapters there.
Yeah. So all of the mentions of hell or otherworldly spaces in the New Testament are being written in a period of time where these ideas are already starting to percolate in Jewish apocalyptic texts, and they're also drawing from Greek and Roman notions of the afterlife. And all of those things are starting to come together and coalesce into a Christian idea of hell. So I'm not someone that says there's no hell in the New Testament, as convenient as that would be. I think that Christians are beginning to develop an idea of hell at this time. But these ideas of for example, the punishment of rebel angels, right, are apocalyptic thinking at this time in Jewish texts and in early Christian texts that are written by first century Jews, are really bringing in different cosmic figures, right? You'll have different otherworldly beings, and you'll have cosmic conflict as a major theme. And all of this demonstrates that our earliest ideas about hell that early Christians are developing in these texts are drawing creatively upon narratives that would be familiar from the surrounding culture, but they're also retelling them for a particular educational purpose for their audience. The texts that describe afterlife spaces in the New Testament are all using them pedagogically, but to make different points to their audiences. So the idea of the rebel angels can do work for Matthew in one place and be in a completely different text in a much later period and be doing something different for 2 Peter.
Okay, Matthias, so your question has been successfully addressed by Dr. Henning. So go to sleep. No, just kidding.
But don't dream about hell.
Yeah. You will cut up in the third heaven, my friend. Trust me.
Right.
You will return with good news from there. All right, Zach, any comments so far?
I was just going to add, just for the audience, you were talking about there are other texts that aren't even Christian, that aren't even Jewish, that talk about these tours of the afterlife, like from Plato and Virgil. And that's really interesting because these ideas are not just coming out of nowhere. But that's the only thing I want to add real quick.
They're not coming out of nowhere, and people who had education in the ancient world were likely required to read and memorize the sections of Odyssey or Aeneid that describe these places. So it would have been very familiar, and it would have been understood that, oh, we're telling a hell story now so that we can learn something from it.
All right, let's move on here. So the third question, Dr. Henning, what are some takeaways of chapter 1? And what's the idea behind gendered bodily suffering in the ancient world?
Okay. So I already shared what I think was for me was one of the most astounding discoveries when I wrote chapter 1, which is that I talked about the Clement passage, which I opened the chapter with. When Clement of Alexandria basically lays out that he's using, like in this passage on describing men's and women's bodies, that to be woman is to suffer, he's really articulating in Christian language an ancient medical idea of men's and women's bodies. And so the overlay that we see in early Christian texts elsewhere implicitly that plays out these gender realities is made very explicit by Clement in that passage. But then the other piece about the fact that this is sort of borne out in the osteoarchaeological evidence that this is also observable in people's bodies helps me understand how an ancient society that is organized around patriarchy would use what they knew about people in their world to then recreate and create again, to recreate afterlife spaces that mirror what they understand about the body on Earth. But the bodily differences that we see in and the gender differences that we see in medical texts and then Christian theological texts that are drawing on those end up being reinforced and given divine power by identifying them as universal and God ordained and for all time, right? And this has huge detrimental impacts on people for millennia.
All right, there you have it. Okay, following the extracts here from your book, Dr. Henning, you said this text used masculinity and bodily normativity to police behavior, equating early Christian ethical norms with masculinity and bodily health. The punishments of early Christian hell not only mirrored the bodies of the disabled in the real world, but also intensify and reinforce the idea that bodily difference was a punishment for sin. Wow. For some reason, I don't know, perhaps I'm wrong on this, but this just harkens back for me in my mind those laws about the priests. They have to be fit to do in service at the tabernacle, and if something abnormal was found in there physically or whatever, they were just not they didn't qualify. But what I am understanding here, Dr. Henning, is that, and perhaps this is, I don't know if this is something like what's the word, a predetermined a fate for people that is part of some idea present at the time in the philosophical, sociological, or religious environment in there, or what's going on here. Just the last line of this extract caught my attention.
Yeah. So there are competing ideas of disability in the ancient world, but one of them that we see explicitly again and again in the depictions of hell is the idea that a body that, and this is tied to gender, as I mentioned earlier, a body that is weak, leaky, and porous is effeminate and is less than a body that is strong, hard, and pervious. And so some of this had to do with ancient mortality rates and also the fact that ancient medical care was not what ours is today, right? So a much larger percentage of the population would be disabled in antiquity and would die earlier. And so there was a projection on to the disabled that would suggest, and actually not suggest explicitly, state that to be disabled was divine punishment. And then when we see bodies being tortured in ways that mirror ancient illnesses or prisons where people would contract illness because of the conditions, now we have disability being depicted in these really vivid ways as a punishment. So it's not just a metaphor at this point, it's a realized metaphor in the description of the afterlife.
Would that apply to women as well?
Yes. So women were understood to be able to perform their gender identity in different ways. But essentially, when Clement says that to be a woman is to be assigned to suffering, he's suggesting that to be a woman is to be assigned to a lesser existence and one that is not equally valued by God.
I need to say this. I most likely wouldn't get along with most of the church fathers. No, I mean,
so
forgive me for my honesty. Yeah.
He's taking this directly from the medical literature of his day, right? Like, this is what people in this world thought about women and their bodies, right? So to be damned is to be womanly, and to be womanly is to be damned.
I mean, I have my mother, and she's like many of us are. Someone wrote this famous line: "Mother should be for forever, for eternity."
Mm-hmm.
And she's a warrior, like many mothers out there. Yeah. And it does. Woman has been the target for a long, long time. And religious context, probably, I don't know, what do you think, Dr. Henning? But probably in religious context, it's where this has taken. We can see more cases about where women, they have suffered a lot of perhaps persecution, or being played down or underestimated or whatever. So why? I mean, it's incredible. To some extent, I understand why today there are a lot of women. I don't know what you call it in English, but it's like women, they are fighting for what they deserve, perhaps, or because perhaps the community, they are just fed up with this kind of approach to their, just for being woman. What's going on there? And the Bible, perhaps this is something most people won't like it, but the Bible is no exception. Okay. And the way I assimilate that idea, I don't know about you, Zach, but the way I assimilate the idea is because, let's face it, the Bible, yes, you can say it's the word of God. Fine. I have no problems with that. But you just can sweep under the rug the fact that it was written by human beings. And those human beings, they have preconceptions, prejudices, views that most likely you won't get along with them. And it is what it is. So I see the Bible not being an exception. Of course, it can give us a windows into the past. What happened to some extent? What were the cultural disposition toward women in this case? And just see it from left to right. What's the change? So what I understand, Dr. Henning, is that in the time of the church fathers, this didn't change a lot. Yeah.
That's
right there.
The Bible is definitely not an exception. The biblical authors are writing to other people in a patriarchal world in the first century, and they are themselves a part of that world. So they're using the language of their world to persuade other people in that world. And so we have in our biblical texts also the sediment of a patriarchal society. And so that's one of the reasons why I think interpretation of the Bible, especially if you believe it is the word of God, is so important, because you as interpreter have a responsibility to handle something that powerful ethically and carefully, because when you assign divine significance to anything, it has a tremendous amount of power, and that means that it can do great good and it can also do great harm.
Okay, I agree with that. So it's a double-edged sword right there. Let's move on here. So Zach, let's go with your questions.
So, gendered bodies, social identities, and the susceptibility to sin are categories belonging to Chapter 2. What role do these terms play in the way hell was thought of in these early Christian apocalypses?
Good. Okay. So I'm going to try not to use any of those big words that I used in that sentence. What I'm trying to say in Chapter 2 is that
my bad.
I'm dealing with texts that are we're going from the 2nd century all the way through to the 6th century, sometimes later than that. And what I started to notice is that the sins that were punished and the people that were punished for those sins changes over time. It was the hardest chapter of the book to write in many ways, because every time I wrote a section of the book focusing on a different sin, I had to do all of this research into different periods of time and how those different bodily identities and social norms changed over time in different societies. But one of the big takeaways for me of doing that research is that for certain sins, in the earliest of these apocalypses, men and women are punished alongside each other. So for example, any sins that had to do with parenthood in the earliest text, men and women are punished right alongside each other. And then by later periods of Christian history, we notice that those sins pertaining to parenthood become only a woman's responsibility. And the punishments become, the expectations become much stronger. So it's not just that a woman has to carry every pregnancy to term in these texts. It also suggests that a woman can be damned if she doesn't nurse other people's children, like orphans who she finds in the street. So if you come across an orphan in the street and you don't offer them your breast, you are punished for all of eternity. So women go from being held culpable for the same parenting responsibilities in the 2nd century to, by the early medieval period, being expected to not only do all of the parenting responsibilities, and men don't get punished for those sins at all, but they're also expected to parent other people's children. And to use their bodies in ways that would also be costly to them, which we talked about the long-term health impacts of repeated pregnancies and nursing on women's bodies earlier. So that's just one example, but there were lots of examples that I cover across the chapter where the idea is that certain kinds of people are more susceptible to certain types of sins, and that changes over time based upon the geographic region and the period of history that we're in. And this also tells us then something about how those early Christians in that period of time thought about their bodies and other people's bodies, and what counted as a sin in any period of history as well. And so the fact that I could observe change at all told me a lot about the way that sin itself was constructed by different groups of early Christians.
All right, thank you, Dr. Henning. Let's move on here. Question number number 5. There you go. Zach, go ahead.
Tell us more about how Chapter 3 and how you say, well, let's back up there. Tell us more about Chapter 3. How is gender and bodily suffering associated, and what's that got to do with hell as portrayed in these texts?
So it's not just that there are different punishments for men and different punishments for women in different periods of time, like we just talked about. It's also the case that the punishments themselves rely on ideas about women's bodies or men's bodies in order to depict sin in particular ways. So essentially, if you're a man and you're being punished in hell for a sin that you've committed, the male body is made effeminate by the punishment itself. These bodies are leaking. They're often weeping for all eternity. They're crying out in pain. All of these things were signs of effeminate, disabled bodies in antiquity. And we've already talked a little bit about how the disabled body itself is viewed as effeminate and in antiquity, and then how that is turned into a way to amplify the significance of eternal torment, and to show that not only are you being consigned to hell, but your body is being turned into a disabled and effeminate body for all of eternity.
And just for some clarity there, so maybe could you give us an example or just a concept in general of how we see this in the text in these tours? Is someone like Peter just walking around and seeing a woman on the street, and this is what do we see in these texts?
Yeah. So you're seeing different parts of hell. So the tour that Peter is on is specifically of the spaces of hell. And you're seeing bodies hung upside down. You're seeing them in flames up to different levels. That's really in the Apocalypse of Paul. There's a scene where different people are being punished with fire up to different parts of their body. You're seeing wounds, bleeding, and all of these punishments. And one of, I shouldn't say favorite, that's the wrong word. One of the most interesting punishments is in the Apocalypse of Paul, where it says that this is the place for the worst sinners, and it's actually the cold place in hell. And people are freezing cold and their teeth are chattering. This mirrors the punishment in the mines that we know is the punishment that is reserved for the lowest status members of society in antiquity. And we have excellent evidence now through the work on prisons that my colleagues, Matthew Larson and Mark Letney, have done, showing us that these prisons were extremely cold, dark places. They had no facilities, right? People are defecating and they're going to the bathroom in the mines. They would become sick. They would acquire disabilities through their existence in these spaces and these underground mines. And so the cold place in the Apocalypse of Paul, and then to be, so chattering of teeth, I talk at length in the book about the chattering of teeth passage, right? This is an image that evokes the idea of a weak womanly body in antiquity. So that's just one example. Paul is going all through hell and he sees all these different punishments, and then he gets to the worst one, the cold place, and you have the people who are in this dark, dank place and their teeth are chattering and it's freezing cold like it would have been in the ancient mines. So this is just one example, and I go through and describe all of the different types of punishments that we see and how they draw on ancient ideas about the body that would have been evocative and familiar for people and would have signaled to them that, wow, these punishments are really bad and you want to avoid them by doing these ethical behaviors because you don't want your body to be made disabled and female for all of eternity.
Appreciate that. And so let's get into Mary's tours of hell. So in your book, you bring up atonement along with gender. What insights can you share about with this chapter?
So in the Mary chapter, I had a lot of material to work with because there are a number of really interesting texts where Mary sees hell. And one of the things that is most distinctive about this is that because of Mary's special relationship with her son, her entreaties for the damned are more efficacious than others, right? She's actually able to win mercy for the damned, and in one text, obliterate hell entirely. The Marian traditions are particularly important for Christians in the East. As you may know, Orthodox Christians do believe that hell is obliterated through the descent during the Passion Week, during the Easter Saturday. So the Mary, and of course Mary is incredibly important in the Eastern Church, and so we have a large number of copies of these texts. We know that they were wildly popular, and it also coheres well with a theology that understands hell to have been conquered already.
Is this, Dr. Henning, is this the so-called harrowing of hell, they call it?
Yeah,
Or
so
is something
that's
else?
one of the
Okay.
things that I talk about. Yeah, so this is the harrowing of hell. But one of the things that is interesting is that Mary is able to do the things that she does in these texts, not in spite of her gender, but because of it. So her special relationship to Jesus as mother, allows her to have a special atoning role in these texts. She's also seen as a kind of leader of the other disciples in the concept of reconfigured family as a model for discipleship. And so these things are all not incidental to Mary's role as woman, but very much connected to her identity, her gender identity. So I wanted to be really careful to show different aspects of the way that gender was understood in antiquity. And it's not to say that these aren't also part of a patriarchal world, but there are early Christian traditions in which gender plays a different function, even as some of the same conceptions of bodily suffering and gender are depicted alongside that.
Really fascinating.
So you're saying, sorry, no, I was just going to say, so you're saying this is not a black and white thing when it comes to gender.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I got that. I got it.
It's not all one note in these texts, and I really try to be careful to show all of the different nuance that I can in, while also describing text to people that they may have never read. So that's the other challenge here. I don't expect that people are familiar with these texts or really have spent a lot of time reading them or.
Right. Yeah. So let's talk about what you call in your book, Making Hell on Earth in Ancient Christian Hell's Archive, or Afterlives, I should say. Ancient Christian Hell's Afterlives. So tell us about those.
Yeah, so I've already touched, I kind of alluded to this a little bit with the idea specifically that these influence contemporary ideas of criminal justice, right? But when I say, and Marv, you already kind of touched on this as well with your reflections, right? When I talk about women being assigned to suffering or bodily suffering as a womanly thing, unfortunately today that doesn't really shock people because that idea hasn't just gone away, right? And these texts have had, even though we might not know their names and we've never read them, these texts through Dante and others in the Christian tradition have had a huge influence on the way that we think about bodies, gender, punishment, disability. And so I give a number of examples in the book, but really what I want people to understand is that, we might want to pat ourselves on the back and think, wow, I'm glad that we don't have any of these backward ideas about gender or disability or punishment in our world. Those ancient Christians were really, rotten. Unfortunately, we haven't come all that far from some of these ideas in certain places in our world. And so I'm inviting people to think about how do we think about disability? How do we think about gender? How do we think about criminal justice? Do we really still think that the punishment should fit the crime, that people from lower stratum of society should have harsher punishments assigned to them, and that elite members of society should have lesser punishments? Do we think that to be sick and to be disabled is to be effeminate, right? Like there are studies that demonstrate that we still think about sickness and disability as emasculating in our contemporary world, and that we think about able-bodied existence as a privilege that should be guarded at all costs. And I give the example of the global pandemic and the way that we thought about disability during that time period as another example where it did seem like, and it was the case, that we thought that protecting the disability community was not all that important. So I think that there's a lot to be learned from studying these texts, even if the topic itself is not something that we want to dwell on. And I spend a lot of time with my students looking at contemporary media examples that allow us to understand how our own contemporary imaginations ask us if we really are continuing to make hell on earth, and if we want to make different choices going forward.
Okay. I think you Zach, you just dropped the questions right there, which is good. So we're moving fast forward there. Dr. Henning, before we come to an end to this interview, for which we're thankful again, I just want to ask you about this literature that you also mentioned in your book, The Acts of Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
How that has to do with the overall topic we've been addressing so far.
So the Acts of Thomas also has a depiction of a tour of hell. It is a fascinating one because in that text in particular, a disciple is regularly frequenting a brothel. He begs his favored sex worker to convert, and she does convert, and then he begs her to marry him, which she does not agree to, and then she has this vision in which there are and then I left out the most disturbing part, where he kills her, and then there's this vision of hell, and the punishments are all related to sexuality, and then she's resurrected by the disciple and describes her vision, and nowhere in the vision that she has are there any punishments for murderers, incidentally. So that's really troubling. And then the whole point of the vision seems to be focused on her engagement as a sex worker in antiquity, and not really at all on the male disciples' choices. So that one is a big part of chapter 2. And I talk about that text a lot there.
Okay. Well, the other thing, the other reason I'm asking about Thomas is because, how close was this gospel to make it to the canon? Was it considered a list, or was just from the get-go just dismissed? That's a canon question.
Yeah, I think we could have a whole extra podcast on canon. Yeah. But unfortunately, I need to get going. But we can pick up other topics another time, maybe.
Definitely. All right. So, guys, in the audience, people watching this video, from after it's published there, thank you for being here, Dr. Henning. Thank you for graciously accepting our invitation to come on to the show and addressing our questions as well. I think we have advanced the conversation. This kind of interview is just to go to the surface, but there's a lot to get into the weeds here, to dig deeper. But we're trying to do this interview just to expose the general audience to what's going on in biblical scholarship, and that there is a lot to learn, and we need to stay at least humble about our views and opinions, and try to be better informed. And you guys are doing the hard work, for which we thank you.
Thank you.
So, any last comments?
No, thank you so much for having me.
No, it's been a pleasure. Zach, thank you for being here.
Yes.
So we're going to be until the next time. Any last comments you want to say?
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
There you go. Succinct. That's what I call. So to everybody, thank you. And be until the next time. Bye.